Chapter 34 Mona. With a whistling, creaking breath, like the forest swaying beneath a heavy wind, the shadows compressed and vanished. The world ceased its trembling, the stone on his belt flared back to life, the weapons dimmed and the lanterns flickered. Ember's muscles ached and his joints felt stiff, as if he had just run a great distance without pause, but there was no time to dwell on the discomfort, for Kentucky had already slipped halfway down the treasure pile. She dug her hands into the mound, toes splayed to keep from slipping any further. All rational thought flew from his head. He scrambled to the top of the mound and reached down. But it was too late. The dusty black cowl swiveled to face her, stinking breath emanating from its depths. Ember gagged, but Kentucky slid a bit further down the slope, and the further still, until at last she crouched directly opposite the tattered phantom. It tilted its head unnaturally far to one side, and then the other, observing her from every angle with an eerily singular focus. Half his instincts warned him to hide, to shelter himself from the sight of that thing. The other half screamed at him to protect the sirena, a creature from whom he could not even defend himself. Gritting his teeth, he dragged himself and Fishbitter over the pile, clambering painfully down to the other side. By the time he reached the bottom, Kentucky had already glided across the floor. "Don't, Mona." Ember stopped short, blood chilling and thickening in his veins. That voice, it echoed all over the room, like 100 baritone men speaking as one. Deep, ragged, with a sibilant current which swept beneath, as if his words were about to crack into a full-throated hiss at any moment. Ancient, powerful, otherworldly. What hope do I have against such a beast? He thought slowly, squeezing Fishbitter. What hope has she? Maker's breath sustain us, or we are surely doomed. Though what sort of doom had not yet been determined, the delay brought him little comfort. It would not be pleasant or wholesome. Of that he was already certain. Gripping the sword, Ember willed his legs to move, to carry him forward one step at a time. The creature's clawed hand lifted, touched her face, several of its knuckles were gnarled and crippled, and thin lightning-like scars formed a hollow trough down the inside of its arm. The wound grew thickest at the crook of the elbow, and disappeared beneath a ragged sleeve. Countless glittering rings adorned those twisted fingers, and Ember glimpsed human runes on a few of the metal bands. Kentucky stood rigid as it traced the thin silvery blemish down her left cheek, coming to a stop just under her chin. "Mona." It breathed, and the lanterns flickered. "The shadow of the past has returned to me once more. I feared you were but another fleshless spirit haunting my dreams." Ember listened, shocked, to the creature's words. They were perfectly articulated, perfectly intoned. Even Syl had a peculiar accent to her speech, and Kentucky often made do with simple words. This fiend must be human, or had been human once upon a time. Else it had spent so long wandering these halls, encountering naught but human things, that it had molded itself to become like one in speech. "I am no spirit," Kentucky said slowly, a bit of indignation creeping through. "But that is not my name, nor am I knowing you. I would be remembering such an encounter." The smile that quirked her lips seemed perverted, drawn from her by those insidious words. Ember glared at her, aghast. The cowled creature recoiled slightly. "Indeed. How strange. And yet you were Mona in face and voice." "Ah, my love." And its hand fell from her chin. "You will not forget me again, Mona, of that I will make certain." Flushing with anger, Ember lifted the sword, regaining some mobility through sheer outrage. And the figure turned to him, quick, like a snake. "Touch her." Ember's mouth dried out and the words died on his tongue as the creature tilted its head again, granting him full view of the shadowy abyss of its cowl. Something lay within, but it was unclear exactly what. He had an idea. After a tight swallow, he licked his lips and managed, "Touch her again, and I'll kill you." He had not the slightest inkling how, of course, but he was compelled to say it anyway. In hindsight, it was likely a mistake. But the sight of its pale hand on her face made him ill. It observed him quietly for a moment. And then, back went the hood, swept off with a flick of his wrist. Ember choked, stupefied. A single black eye, dark as a cloudy night sky, bored into him. To its right lay an empty, twisted socket, charred and shadowed. Webbed ears, much larger than Kentucky's, rested on either side of his ridged neck, tattered almost beyond recognition. Dark hair hung in leafy patches around his gaunt face, roughly shorn with a knife or a dagger. His white skin looked particularly thin and bruised, and though it appeared soft and glittered faintly in the dusky light, he noticed grayish lines that resembled broken pottery. As if the skin had cracked and healed again, 1,000 times or more, leaving him with only those faint scars beneath the surface. You. More power resonated in that single word than Kentucky's entire song, which had driven the shadow birds away. Ember stilled, and even his heartbeat slowed at the sound of it. A gift, Mona? A costly gift indeed. His lips trembled momentarily, and then curled into a sneer. He who would shatter the hearts of our brethren as they slumber. Or was it you, Mona? Have you finally betrayed me? We did not mean to wake the spell, Kentucky murmured sleepily, her focus still fixed on the other siren. We did not know. The siren's gaze sent cold tingles through Ember's entire body. His eye was lifeless, like black ice. It wandered over him, void of emotion, flickering here and there, until it alighted on Fishbitter. A shadow fell across his face, and he sucked in his already gaunt cheeks. His mouth moved slightly, whispering words that Ember might have missed had he not heard them before. A pretty sort. It was plain from the quiet soreness, the disdain upon his face, and the sudden tightness in his bearing that this was not his first encounter with Fishbitter. The siren lowered his chin ever so slightly, black ice eye pressing into Ember's mind. Behind it lurked a dreadful nothingness. At last, to Ember's great relief, he shifted his penetrating stare to Kentucky, and growled, "He will suffice. You are wise, Mona, to have brought such sustenance on your journey. I confess that I was angered by your delay. But think not that I am ungrateful, for the nights grow ever longer and the seasons pass as one beneath my mountain. We shall partake. Together." A faint, bothered HMMH made Ember look at her as well. Kentucky's face was drawn and her eyes hooded. Some of the hazy uncertainty had lifted from her, and she licked her lips, glancing from Ember to the siren and back again. "You did bring him for me, did you not?" The creature purred, slipping 2 fingers under her chin and tilting her head upward. She gazed into his single eye, utterly lost. Ember lifted Fishbitter, staggering forward in a kind of hopeless horror, and Kentucky put out a hand, forcing him to lower the blade. When she turned, it was with a serenely beautiful smile that melted his resolve. "No, Ember," she crooned. "Do you not see? It is for the good of all." "I don't see," he snapped, pleased to see her twitch backward at the sound of his voice. He felt cruel as her smile faltered, in spite of himself, but even those 3 rough words had cleared some of the siren's foul enchantment from the atmosphere. "Would you care to explain?" Ember's head throbbed with a rush of blood. So, this was it. This was how it all ended. "He is not knowing," she mourned at last, her eyes misting again as she turned to the siren. "But he will understand. I can see that you are as much enamored of him as I. Fear not, the secret of his people will be ours. For my Ember shall give it to us freely." He had no idea what she meant, yet her words compelled him to agree. "I shall. Of course I shall." But that was not what he wanted to say. Far from it. The long row of skulls and crude etchings on the pillow flashed through his mind, and with great effort of will, he fixed his gaze upon the disfigured siren, who eyed him with a look of such intensity that Ember knew he was already dissecting him, deciding which part to eat first, and huffed, "I shall do no such thing. Nor would I do any service for this murderer. And no manner of torment or trickery would persuade me otherwise." The siren's fathomless eye flickered to his Mona. And then he unleashed a booming call of laughter, like thunder and rain and jackdaws in the morning. Mona Part 2. "Ah, Mona," he chortled, but his eye was locked on Ember, a mad gleam sparking in its depths. "You were always so persistent. These mortals have no care for you, and have you not seen this, after all these 1,000 years we have endured alone in the dark? Abandon this fool's errand, lest fate mock you on to the end of eternity." "Did you not?" Kentucky whimpered, confusion wrinkling her brow. also come to this mountain, Sea King." "Enough," I said. A vicious snarl made Ember reflexively jump back. He corrected himself, stepping toward Kentucky to ward off a blow, but the siren seemed to have forgotten his existence altogether, nor did he make any move to strike the younger Serena. Kentucky appeared crestfallen, and her gaze had lost some of its cloudiness. "But enough," it gurgled, and its hollow socket flashed to life. Magic glimmered green and sickly yellow before it was lost to shadow again, rippling all the way down the scar from his neck to his curled fingers and winking out. "It is all vanity," seethed the siren, its throat bobbing and the fingers of its maimed hand clenching. "As vanity it ever was. I shall not be made a fool again. Let us feast on his flesh, crack the marrow from his bones, and quench our thirst of his life's blood. He is of no use to us." "But, HHHHRRRRUMMM, the siren grumbled, briefly clamping his twisted claws over her mouth. Ember flinched, but the rumbling voice kept his feet stuck to the stone. "Do you not yearn for his mortal blood upon your tongue? Can you not smell the life within him?" "Yes." Kentucky's lips parted, and her black eyes slid to Ember's. "Yes. I smell it." He swallowed hard, the tip of the blade quivering in his hand as she trailed off into gentle murmurings and whimperings. "Ages," whispered the siren, a recitation of some sort, Ember thought blearily. Ages upon ages of darkness. Trapped within this singing, muttering stone. With naught but the voices of the dead to regale me. And here another light has come to me at last. Dull panic flooding his mind, Ember lifted Fishbutter. This time it thrummed, as if it hungered for their blood as much as they hungered for his. The sensation emboldened him and he tightened his hands around the hilt, taking a single step back. "Where can I go? Where can I hide?" Grumbling a minglement of human and siren words, they lurched forward as one, the same yearning twisting their features, a desperate hunger. He meant nothing to either of them. Food for starving wolves. That's what he was. Ember twitched the sword point from the monstrous siren to Kentucky Blee, and her gaze flashed to the blade. She blinked, glancing back to his face, and a muscle below her left eye twitched. The fog of confusion lifted from her in an instant, and in the next she had swooped down and up again and fled across the hall, leaving a loud metallic clatter in her wake. It took Ember several seconds to realize she had scooped up a handful of rusty coins and jewels and thrown them in the siren's face. The beast stood utterly still, blinking rapidly at Ember. A trickle of thin blackish blood oozed down the bridge of his nose. Kentucky was chanting foreign words, quick and quiet, and they roused Ember from what remained of the siren's spell. His unsteady legs carried him across the ocean of coins, and he swung Fishbutter at the ghoulish specter. It dodged his blow with a feral hiss that scattered Kentucky's words like leaves in the autumn. "No," he rasped. 15,000 strong could not pry it from their mortal hands. "What hope have you, Mona? You cannot betray me. We are bound forever." A faint whine rose above his words, but Ember could not tear his eyes from the skulking beast. "No wretched she-whelp shall steal what I have bled and died for 100 times over in vain. Lies, lies, all lies. Too long I have hungered. They denied me my birthright." The siren gave a low and piteous moan, fell voice rattling deep within his sunken chest, and for a moment a profound sorrow washed over Ember, not an understanding in the clear sense, but a reckoning with the color of his words. Helpless tears streamed down his cheeks. The creature turned to him and its hollow face twisted, freezing him in place. "So be it," roared the siren, pointing an imperious jeweled finger at Ember. He gulped in a breath and denied his twitching nerves, denied his shaking muscles, denied this wicked thing its wish to sup his blood, and slashed at that gnarled hand with all his might. He effortlessly dodged the inexperienced blow, catching Ember's wrist in cold, bony fingers. They were soft and dry as dust. Ember choked as the monster wrenched his arm, and Fishbutter clanged uselessly against the pile. A smoldering light burned deep in the siren's empty eye socket, and he put out his bluish tongue like a snake, reaching for Ember's throat with clawed fingers. Rotten breath swept over him, pinning him in place. "Wait." The mountain hushed all other sound, ringing with the clear echoes of that pure, musical summons. Kentucky stood at the very top of the treasure trove beside the makeshift throne, a few jewels trickling down behind her from a sudden scramble. Her chest heaved, but she spread out her arms and flaunted her shapely figure as best she could. Noble and pitiful, brimming with a lusty innocence, as much a living contradiction as ever she had been. Ember thought his heart should stop. In that moment, she appeared to him as a queen. An ancient royal from a bygone age, arrayed in a cloak of thick black hair and the threadbare attire of a boy. Fleeting mischief sparkled in her gaze as she caught his attention, and vanished as the siren's head snapped toward her. Smoothing her hands along her jerkin, Kentucky sniffed once and blinked down at him, murmuring 3 short words in the siren tongue that set Ember's blood afire. He could not understand them, but their meaning was clear enough. "Come and take me. If you dare." The siren stared at her a moment longer, shuddering and shivering and growling and twitching his ragged ears, and then snatched up Fishbutter's silvery hilt with a savage cry and lifted the sword above Ember's head. The blade shimmered and flashed to life, like a fish leaping from the water and sparkling in the sunlight. Kentucky released a screech the likes of which Ember had never heard in his life, and wished never to hear again. He sat bolt upright, freed from the unholy breath of the beast. The siren likewise turned at once, slashing Fishbutter aside and narrowly missing Ember's throat. They moved as one, both caught by her enchantment. Ember had no time to unsling his spear. He reached for a broken blade jutting out of him but the other siren roared, a bellow that swelled until it reached such trembling depths and terrible heights that the whole room quaked with it. Treasure toppled from the pile and Kentucky staggered, her face contorted, crying out words that Ember could not hear. For his hands were pressed firmly over his ears, and the scene had erupted into stars and apples of blinding sunlight. The immense pain sent the white-hot illusion snapping across his field of vision, hiding both sirens from his view. And then, with a sharp pop, the world went silent around him. But the pain did not stop and Ember went on screaming, his voice a nothingness, a breath in the void, drowned by power of the creatures that surrounded him. He was lost, she was lost, they were all of them, lost. "Get up." Warm liquid trickled through his fingers. "Help her." He tried to open his eyes, but the tears reduced his vision to a dark blur. "Kill him." Ember twitched toward the broken blade as darkness swallowed him whole. He fought against it with all the willpower he had left, but it came for him anyway, and with it a measure of relief, though he cursed himself, for the blackness banished the unbearable anguish. His fingers relaxed on his ears and he pressed his face against the cold stone. But the fear, the dread, the twisted shrieks pursued him deep into the shadowy abyss. Relentless and all-consuming. Ember slowly uncurled himself, prying his hands from his ears and dry swallowing. He forced his eyes open and stared listlessly at his fingers, which were sticky with half-dried blood. His head ached horribly, and a sharp pain stabbed deep in his ears with every heartbeat. A vague remembrance that he had been involved in some sort of skirmish disturbed his mental calm, but all was still and quiet. He took 3 deep breaths. A weapon. He had been reaching for a weapon. Ember instinctively twisted around to grasp his spear, rapping his knuckles against a metal goblet. It tipped and rolled across a few scattered coins. He heard nothing. "I'm deaf," was his first thought, followed shortly after by, "Kentucky." No, confound it all. Breathing hard and fast, Ember rocked to his knees. More coins skittered across the floor. The 2 sirens were nowhere to be seen. He called out Kentucky's name before realizing that he would never hear her response, and stomped his foot on the ground, biting out a few frustrated oaths. No Fishbutter, no Kentucky, and no way to find them. His head swam. "Don't panic. Think, Ember, think." The door. Kentucky had always been the predator in his eyes, the fox in the bushes, but now she was the frightened rabbit instead. He had to guess her escape route immediately, and he had to be right. All the worst things that could possibly be happening to Kentucky flashed through his mind. There was no time to make a mistake. Whispering a quick prayer for courage that was lost to the stifling silence, he shouldered the spear and scrambled up the pile as quickly as he could, hand over white-knuckled hand. Bits and pieces of abandoned treasures were wrenched loose as he ascended, tumbling soundlessly out of sight behind him. When he reached the top, relief surged through him at the sight of the buried door. The hoard of gems and trinkets had been disturbed near the top, and the shallow furrow considerably widened. They had gone this way. He slid down the other side of the pile, grasped his spear again, crouched, and inhaled deeply as if he were about to dive into a cold river. There was no light in the hall. The cramped tunnel faded into darkness. No time, no time. Swallowing a lump of fear, Ember plunged headfirst through the doorway, wriggling down the shifting slope with the wooden spear before him and the treasure tumbling after. Chapter 35 The Reckoning. Darkness, dust, aching muscles, bruised knees, and the constant cuts and scrapes from the uneven surface beneath him encroached on Ember's mind, blotting out all other sensations save the rhythmic reach-grab-pull repeat of his forward movements. He had begun to fear that he would be forced to crawl until he died of exhaustion, and he thought it encouraging, for something was changing when the air grew noticeably colder and a dampness seeped through the stone. The trinkets beneath him grew slimy to the touch as the treasure mound dwindled. A muffled tremor shook the walls, and he hesitated as dust and bits of shattered stone fell down around him. If it was not the sirens, then it was surely something else he did not wish to meet. Faster, Ember. By the time he had room to shuffle along at an awkward crouch, the tremors had become a steady vibration, and everything around him rattled and bounced. He staggered, briefly resting his hand against the slick wall, and then set foot on uncovered stone. A single coin rolled away from the pile, disappearing into the black void of the room beyond. Ember gathered himself, readied his spear, and held out the stone light. It barely pierced the darkness, and he guessed, too late, that it had been dimmed by the siren's call to the shadow birds. "Light," he commanded hoarsely, unable to hear the sound of his own voice. "Give me light." But the stone remained inert, and he clenched it angrily, stepping into the darkness. More crumbles pelted the floor before him, and he swayed as another tremor shook the ground. The shadows before him shifted slightly, and he knew he was not alone. Instinct and reason collided in his mind. Ember threw the stone. It whipped toward those phantom shapes. He couldn't wander in blind, and holding on to the only source of light became more dangerous with each passing second. The glow bounced silently off the rocky wall and landed in a puddle with a visible splash, sending out ripples of amber light. The siren crouched above it, his cowl torn asunder. Fishbitter lay abandoned at his feet, gleaming in the shallow water. His lips peeled back in a snarl, bearing two massive fangs, one of which had been broken off at the tip. Kentucky balanced precariously on an outcropping of sheer rock far above. Fresh claw marks mangled the surface below her, and one hand was lifted, mouth open in a scream. Dark liquid dripped from her fingertips and spattered the side of her face. Her jerkin had been torn at the collarbone, revealing a gaping wound across her chest. The siren's head turned slowly to acknowledge the glowing stone at his feet, some of the vibrations ceasing as his jaw snapped shut. Then his single eye fixed on Ember. Ember glowered, the spear shaking in his hand. A smirk curled the siren's mouth, but as he began to speak, Ember unleashed the most gut-wrenching yell he could muster. It didn't matter that his voice possessed not even the faintest hint of magic, only that it caused enough disturbance to fracture his spell. Kentucky's head jerked up and her eyes widened. The siren's face contorted and a growl thrummed through the floor, but Ember did not give him a chance to refocus his efforts. He ran, spear lifted, shouting wild oaths. Undaunted, it snatched up the grimy sword with a bloodthirsty grin, flinging water from the blade, and met him halfway in 3 quick bounds. Fishbutter sliced the air between them, bearing down on Ember with such speed and force as could cleave a man's skull in two. No time to think, dodge, or strike. The blade flashed, blue light rippling across the hammered metal. It never touched him. The monster unleashed a soundless howl as Fishbitter rebounded, wrenching his fingers apart and whirling backwards with shocking velocity. Several of those bony fingers remained bent at odd angles. They faced each other, equally stunned, and Ember ran him through. It happened too quickly to comprehend more than a brief tug and sickening give as the spear pierced the siren's muscular body. He plunged it as deep as it would go, until a full hand's width of the pole was buried in pale flesh. While the creature stood gasping with the spear between its ribs, Ember let go and leaped away, sprinting for the sword, arms flailing, head pounding. The silence was harrowing. "Don't look back, don't look back." When less than 3 strides remained between himself and the fallen weapon, Ember dove across rough stone, reaching, fingers grazing the hilt. He skinned his knuckles, grasped it, and scrambled to his feet. His adversary had only just turned to face him, jaw slack, a trickle of black blood oozing from the corner of its mouth. Then it let out a gaping, wordless screech, and Ember reeled sideways as the stone shook underfoot. Powdery rock fell like rain, but fishbitter grew warm in his hand and he clung to it, courage swelling in his chest. He had done it, bested it, slain it. But his elation subsided as the hideous creature remained upright, lean muscles rippling with strength and rage. The dead eye flickered with the last vestiges of a long-forgotten spell, and froth flew as it shook its head, slavering and gnashing its teeth. Ember raised fishbitter yet again, becoming more attuned to the weight and balance of it even as his courage faltered. It no longer felt so heavy in his hands. The siren advanced like a wingless bird of prey, hulking, stilted, one hand curled around the spear where it entered his torso. He snarled and snapped it off as if it were merely a twig, barely stumbling. Blood trailed after him, staining the cracked stone. The worst of his slow advance was that Ember had time. Time to think, to feel. He tightened his grip on the sword and it shimmered gleefully, humming in his hands. His empty stomach and recent exertion made his head light and limbs shaky. "Don't faint," he thought desperately. He circled his otherworldly opponent, consciously slowing his breath to calm his racing heart. The mangled siren curled its tongue in a hiss, and as Ember's perspective shifted he noticed Kentucky out the corner of his eye, still hugging the wall. Her lips moved slowly, each word dredged up from someplace deep within, and her eyes were scarcely open. That fleeting glimpse lent him a grim strength, and when he was close enough, Ember took a wild chance with fishbitter. Its flashing blade bit through the monster's chest and nicked his wrist, leaving dark trickle of blood behind. The siren retreated, spewing a stream of unheard curses. Before Ember could take advantage of the opening, it lunged again, shifting their skirmish to the edge of the stone's glow. He stumbled away, careful not to stray too far from the circle of light, for in the darkness he was as good as dead. Again he swung. Again, the siren retreated and advanced. Slowed by the spear, it moved at the speed of a tired but relentless human, giving Ember a chance to think on his feet and combat its attacks, but never enough of a pause to dart past its bony claws and land the killing stroke. It would not stop. Would not die. It came, and came, and came. And no matter how he hacked and slashed, no matter how many hits he scored, it kept coming. Die. Terror and loathing screamed in his mind, twisting toward hysteria. Just die. I've killed you. I've killed you. But he hadn't, and it didn't. The moment Ember felt his back scoff up against the rocky wall was the moment he knew their fight was finished. He had delayed too long, put off risking the fatal blow in favor of defending himself, and now he was cornered. Wet, irregular stone bruised his shoulders as he swung again and again, fishbitter glittering joyously each time he struck blood. But with every miss, the battered siren edged closer, muttering and grumbling and snatching with its claws. He dealt it a grievous wound in the arm, further crippling it, but it hardly seemed to notice. Its entire body was an ancient weapon, its tongue a powerful and deadly poison. Ember had one weapon only, which he hardly knew how to use. Bare-handed, he would have no chance at all. The siren's dead eye flared brighter as its speech grew more exaggerated. It was regenerating its wounded body, he realized, if not fully healing itself, then certainly using its strange chant to dull the pain somehow. He could never win against such tactics, for his own body was growing clumsy, his muscles weary, and his sense of balance fading. Fishbitter began to feel heavy again, and at last something gave with a shocking crack in his right shoulder. He cried out in anguish and frustration, crumpling over and jerkily dragging at Fishbitter's hilt. The sword point skimmed across stone. The cowled siren opened its mouth in a roar of triumph and snatched Ember's arm, single eye burning with a sickly green light. Flash, Ember yelped, nearly dropping the sword as the nightmarish vision drowned in a blaze of golden light. He buried his face in the crook of his elbow, blinded. When his eyes began to adjust, he squinted into the glow. The unmistakable figure of a woman crouched in the middle of the twisting hall, holding something out in one hand. For a moment he thought he saw a tangle of blonde hair and a flashing blue gaze, and so dazzled was he by the brilliance that for a moment he believed the Lady of the Oracles had returned to him, and then clawed fingers clamped around the luminous object, and he recognized Kentucky's shadow. She covered her eyes, head turned away. Stonelight. It blazed in her palm, bright as the midday sun. The flash, which stymied Ember, had done something far worse to the monstrous siren. It stumbled away, palms pressed to its eye and empty socket, shrieking. A rift cracked open the stone floor beneath its feet, tiny fissures branching up the nearest wall, and Ember's bloody ears stabbed him anew as the air shivered. When it ran out of breath, it yanked its hands away from its face, hissing and spluttering, eye flickering wildly here and there, blinded by the light. Gathering up what remained of his strength, Ember hefted the sword one final time and lunged, driving fish butter above the broken spear haft where he thought the creature's heart should be. The Reckoning Part 2. It stared through Ember, uncomprehending. That black ice eye rolled. Blood bubbled on pale lips as they moved to whisper one last word. Mona. The beast toppled, and Ember fell down with it. They were bound by the sword, the dying siren and the man who held the hilt. A terrible intimacy pressed upon him, the powerful rush of taking a life, and the grim knowing that what he was doing had consequences which would ring into eternity. It gurgled, but Ember mercilessly stabbed fish butter deep into that sunken chest, crying out with effort in the repugnance of his actions. Then, bracing one foot on the ground and planting a knee on his torso, pried it loose and slashed the blade across the siren's throat. Gore spattered him from head to toe. He knelt there panting for a moment, watching in morbid fascination as the siren wriggled in its death throes. Only when the body had ceased all movement did Ember dare relax his hold on the sword. All was silent, as before. But the ground no longer trembled, and he could feel his own heart beating again. Until that moment, there was a part of Ember which had hoped, wished, even believed, the siren was merely a figment of the mountain, like the Lady of the Oracles. But the carnage he had wrought lay before him, immutable, death-written in the ink of the siren's brackish blood. Dark liquid, almost blue in the light, pooled around the corpse. Ember withdrew the sword and took a step back, droplets flying loose from the quivering blade. He couldn't look away. It had appeared to him as a monster, a twisted shadow, but something had vanished from that body. It had been alive, possessed a consciousness, which he had extinguished forever. With his own hands, he had plunged that sword into the siren's heart. And for the first time in all his 21 seasons, he grappled with the understanding that Ember Jarlson, a mere boy in the eyes of these immortals, was capable of dealing death. He closed his eyes and fumbled away, letting the sword fall from numb fingers, but the image of the siren's pale body had already been burned into his mind. Ember dropped to his knees, placed his palms on the rough, wet stone, took a heaving breath, and retched. Nothing but bile remained in his empty stomach, but he retched all the same. It was a siren. Not a man. A siren. Not a man. A siren. Not a man. The chant brought him some degree of comfort. Until he thought of Kentucky. Vivid memories of her soft voice, intelligent eyes, and quick wit both convicted him and venerated him, for if Kentucky's soul was equal in worth to that of a man's, then the lonely siren was also equal, however wicked he may have been. It also meant Kentucky's life was worth saving, even if that meant plunging a sword through the heart of her assailant. Thus, Ember arrived at the inevitable conclusion. He had done perhaps not the right thing, but the most fitting thing, indeed, the only thing, that could be done. And no one else was there to do it. So he wiped his face with the back of his hand, fumbled for the water flask, and rinsed his mouth, spitting several times on the damp floor. Then he crawled away from the body and curled over, wrapping his arms around his knees, sheltered by the silence and the darkness of his closed eyes. An unexpected calm whispered through his mind, like a warm breeze drifting through a snowstorm. The whirling thoughts and fears slowed, and a few melted away entirely. Most of the fallen warriors he had encountered beneath Sister's Mountain doubtless killed many sirens, and thought little of it. All had been killed by sirens in the end. But none of them, Ember ventured to guess, had ever held a sirena's hand. They had never fallen asleep with such a creature keeping watch over the hillside, or traveled through tangled woods and thickets to the rhythm of her soft, fey humming. In that way they were as much strangers as kin. By the time the urge to retch had passed and the tears had ceased, he had taken stock of every bruise and open wound on his body. The muscles over his left shoulder twitched sporadically, and even his knees now ached from being sat on for so long. Ember took a deep breath, which he'd hoped to be cleansing but brought with it the stench of mildew and blood, and sat up, opening his eyes. It took him a moment to spot Kentucky. She huddled alone in a corner, near the trickling water, and had abandoned the stone light. It now shone at a reasonable brightness, casting soft shadows on the wall behind her. Her nimble fingers were busily refastening the laces which had been ripped loose from her jerkin. One of the strands was broken, but she tied it together with a little knot, widening the hole with a single claw so that it would fit through. "Kentucky?" he rasped, disconcerted by the silent vibrations of his own voice in his chest. Her chin lifted slightly. "Are you hurt?" Her fingers flew faster and she gave a short shake of her head, allowing him to spot a bit more blood under her chin. Groaning, Ember crawled across the stone, each movement costing him more of the precious energy he had so little of. It was tempting to mutter another oath, but he bit his tongue instead. Kentucky's head twitched upward and she quickly fastened up the jerkin, brushing strands of black hair out of her face and peering at him in the dim light. He hesitated, sitting back and watching her for a moment. Something stirred in Ember's heart. It was not an affection, exactly, nor pride in his own accomplishments. It was something a bit more complicated, perhaps a mingling of the two. For he understood then the dreadful fate from which she had been freed, and how rare and precious a creature was she. He decided at once that he would do it all over again, if he had to. He would battle 1,000 men and sirens, he would kill until he could kill no more, until the mountain ran black with blood, if it only meant that she would be spared. She murmured something, his name, he thought, and crawled across the stone to meet him. He remained perfectly still as she approached, unable to hear a single word. Kentucky's face hovered close to his, her slimy skin glittering very faintly where it had not been smudged with blood or dirt, and before he could pull away she had opened her mouth in a little cry. Her fingers twitched to his ears, brushing crumbles of dried gore from the sides of his face, her lips moving rapidly. Ember blinked and squinted, trying to make out the words. When he could not, his eyes wandered to her breastbone. The gash he had seen by the first light of the stone was somewhat pinched together by the refastened laces, but much deeper than he had at first thought, and tainted with grime. It had not stopped bleeding. She drew back, to his immense disappointment, and observed him expectantly, soft hands brushing the sides of his face. He blinked again, and then realized she must have asked him a question. "What?" "Never mind," Ember muttered, shrugging her hands aside and gritting his teeth as he unfastened a scrap of leather from under his belt. The last healing crystal from the oracle's sanctuary lay just under his fingers, still warm from his body heat, and the mere touch of it through the animal skin made him shiver. Before he could dream up any arguments to keep it for himself, he held it out to her. "Here." Kentucky's eyes flicked to the object in his hand, and then back to his face. But she said nothing and made no move to take it. He flipped the leather aside, revealing the glowing crystal in his palm, and set it on the floor between them. Her lips moved tremblingly, but Ember shook his head. "Take it," he urged, lifting his hands. Kentucky reached down, fingers hovering over the dimly pulsing gem. She hesitated for only a moment, and then seized it with a desperate swiftness. The stone swirled, glowing more brightly, and the particles began to separate. Then, without warning, she pressed her small palm into his, snagging his wrist with her other hand and entwining their fingers. He flinched, but the dust, clear and white and pinkish, was already swirling up his arm. Through fresh tears of relief, he saw the sirena tilt her head back and close her eyes as the healing washed over them both. His ears itched horribly, but before he could jab his fingers into them the world of sound popped back into existence. Ember swallowed several times, allowing himself to enjoy the return of his senses, rushing wind above the ceiling, dust falling afar off, water trickling over stone nearby, Kentucky's steady breathing, and the rustle of his own clothes as he shifted in place. They were soft, soothing sensations after all that had transpired, and he could have sat listening in silence for a full hour or more. But he had to know for certain. "You're not hurt, are you?" he whispered. Kentucky's throat flexed and she slid her hand out from between his. Her eyes darted away. Did he? No, Kentucky assured him, and he was shocked by the ragged edge to her words. "I am my own." Blushing awkwardly and rubbing the back of his neck, Ember glanced away. The body lay crumpled in his periphery, like the last remnants of a particularly disquieting nightmare. Then she added, the words tearing a bit more, "You came." Ember glanced up again, letting his hand fall to his knees. He wondered how long she had been screaming, alone in the dark, desperate to keep the mad siren from tempting her down with his ravishing voice or snatching her from the rocks. "Of course I came," he managed, somewhat breathlessly. "Why would I not come?" Kentucky swallowed several times, licking her lips and hemming quietly. She touched her throat with a finger and winced. Before Ember could say another word, she whispered, "Ah, Ember. I am sorry, Ember. I am very sorry." He took a breath to speak, but she stopped him with a short, faint noise. "Do not say, no, do not look at me," she pleaded, and her eyes gleamed in the light of the stone. "I am wrong to be keeping so much silent. I know it, now." With the suddenness of a thunderclap, her words in the treasure room returned to him, along with a familiar pang of betrayal. "Yes," he said tersely, too tired to be upset and too relieved to say more. Another wince flashed across her face. He attempted to soften his expression, but whatever he managed must have struck her even harder, for she looked down and hollowed her cheeks in dismay. "I will be telling you everything. I promise, Ember, I will tell. But it must wait until we are sleeping and waking, for I cannot gift this story in such a state. I'm not moving from this spot until you tell me," he challenged, crossing his arms. Kentucky gave a weary sigh, and he noticed how sunken and tired her eyes appeared in the stone light. It was the first sign he had seen that their journey had taken its toll on her as well. "I am in no way for storytelling tonight, Ember." "Well," countered Ember, as lightly as he could manage, "I am hardly learned in the arts of siren storytelling. Besides, I've waited long enough for this. Don't you think?" She reached out and grasped his wrist in both her hands, tugging it loose and squeezing his fingers very tightly. It made his heart skip a beat. "Then I shall tell you all at once, but please, no more of this," he warned. "You must tell me everything, now. Please, Ember, let us do it away from this place," she finished in a whisper. As dry and rattly as her words were, they still sent a shiver through his bones, and whether by her persuasion or his growing revulsion for the body which lay all too near to them, he found that he quite agreed. Refreshed by the healing crystal, Ember found his footing again and trudged back to the place where he had dropped fish butter, trying hard not to look at the mangled corpse. A faint grunt of effort and a rustling echoed in the hall as Kentucky arose, and then her sticky footsteps as she padded after him. After a moment of grim hesitation, he retrieved the blood-stained fish butter, truly his sword, he felt at long last, and cleaned it as best he could on the siren's ragged cloak. Only after he had put away the weapon which he beheld with a newfound respect and abhorrence, retrieved the stone light, and cast a longing look at the fragments of his former fishing spear did he reply, "Agreed." A cold hand slipped through his, gritty with bits of stone and a spackling of gore. Their fingers found where they fit best, and together they started away from that foul bed in the hall. An unfamiliar feeling of warm satisfaction kindled in his chest, for it was the first time since leaving his cabin behind that he felt certain the river woman was being forthright. As the blood-stained hall faded into darkness behind them, Ember couldn't help one last glance at the body on the ground. It appeared much smaller than before, perhaps by some trick of the light, and he wistfully admired the rings glinting on those broken fingers. It seemed somehow wrong to leave them there, but he would not touch that thing again. Not for all the gold and jewels of Sister's Mountain. Chapter 36 Hunger. Is it magical? Some sort of spell? Ember, please, we may speak or walk, Kentucky huffed at last, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I have not the breath for both. Far enough, then, decided Ember, plopping down in the middle of the road. He shrugged off Fishbutter's belt in the empty pack, taking a swig from the water flask to quell his thirst and stifle his growling stomach. The crystal seemed to replenish a bit of his energy, but a gnawing ache reminded him that he had not eaten in a day and a half. He briefly considered washing some of the grime from his bare skin as well, but tempting as it was, he could justify it to himself, not when it was so important to Kentucky. At least they were out of the damp. The Serena sat beside him with a whoosh of a sigh, snagged the flask, and took 3 deep draughts, water dribbling down her chin. After pouring a bit more over her fingers and smoothing it along her face and arms, she handed it back to him and closed her eyes. He waited impatiently for several seconds, and then prompted, "Well?" Kentucky blinked, glancing down at her clasped hands. She sat with crossed legs, black hair draped across her shoulders, looking unusually poised. "Is there anything in your life that you are wishing for?" Before he could reply she added, "Something, perhaps, that you are believing you cannot have. But you are wishing so badly that you know you will not be whole without it. That if you cannot have it, life is not worth the living?" Her words were so earnest that Ember sat back and thought seriously about the question. It stumped him for a few minutes, until the most obvious answer occurred to him, one he was reluctant to mention. "Yes," he admitted slowly. "I wish my mother was alive." She stared at him, motionless, listening. Ember cringed and glanced up at the arched ceiling above them, unhappy that their discussion had already taken such a disagreeable turn in his direction. "She died when I was 10 years old, I think. My elder sister cared for me. For a long time after, I couldn't remember what it felt like to smile." He hesitated, struggling to find the mortal words to describe how her death had made him feel. She wasn't always happy, but she always found something to laugh about. She was beautiful, like a ray of sunlight, and when she left she took that sunlight with her. The world was dark to me, even when the skies were clear. I felt as if there was an empty hole in my life, after that. And whenever I tried to fill it with something else, it never quite fit. I guess I've just learned to live with that hole. I don't think about it so much anymore." He paused for thought and then decided he'd said more than enough, crossing his arms and duking his chin to his chest. Even now, a little of that hollow ache returned. The ache that had always been there, and never really left. His sister's departure had left its own empty place, and after a time he could no longer tell them apart. He was simply alone. "A hole," Kentucky repeated, tilting her head. "An empty place." "Yes. You will be understanding a little of what I speak." Ember looked up, flushing angrily. "A little." Her pale hand flashed out and snatched his wrist, offering a squeeze of comfort. Ember shifted, but let her hand remain, somewhat mollified. He had become surprisingly accustomed to her touch. It was still strange to him in many ways, but a fresh familiarity was beginning to make an impression on his mind. Her clammy hands and black eyes no longer frightened him, nor did their odd acquaintance seem so unlikely after all that had occurred under Sister's Mountain. "I apologize," she said quickly. "I am not saying that your sorrows are lesser sorrows. I forget that you are young. Not tasted so much death as I tasted so much death." He wondered if the irony of that phrase was lost on her, or if she meant it on purpose. Either way, it gave him chills. "And," he said stiffly, flicking a bit of dried blood from his arm, "what is this thing you cannot live without?" Another long moment passed, and Kentucky took an impossibly deep breath, her fingers twitching in her lap. "I am thinking. What I seek is what you call a treasure, Ember." The words slowly took root in his mind, and a few possible interpretations presented themselves. "What sort of treasure?" "There's more myth than truth among my clan, but this treasure, I think, is what makes men so strong." he suddenly noticed something flashing in her fingers, one of the coins from the treasure room. The men who were living here, before, when they built their nest in this mountain. So this treasure is ours, Ember said, darkly suspicious. No, Ember, it was ours. She twisted this way and that as she spoke. But no longer. I hear stories of a season when my clan and many others were in possession of it, and our power was as great as that of your kind. Power? You mean magic? Kentucky hummed thoughtfully, and then said, yes. Magic. I don't know anything about magic, he protested. No, but those before you do, when men are not so scattered. All this I am learning from songs and riddles, for we may not speak of it outright. Her cryptic explanation reminded Ember of the villagers' whispered tales of accursed people, and Hunter's warning that those who had seen the river folk were likely to keep it to themselves. He cleared his throat, unsettled. Did men steal this treasure from the sirens? I was told only that it was lost, she said quietly, shrugging. Not stolen. Ember's stomach tightened, and he stared hard at her. Told by whom? Her fingers froze, and the coin stopped flashing, loosely balanced between her thumb and ring finger. She continued fiddling a few moments later, more slowly, and traced the buffed edge with the pads of her fingers. She murmured. The eldest of the clans. The eldest? Your sister? Ah, no, Kentucky chided gently. Sylvie has seen only. Her lips pursed and she blinked slowly, flicking her fingers until it amounted to 293. This many summers. Ember couldn't help a low whistle. That's a long time to be alive. No, she is young, though perhaps wiser than I. She was still gazing down at the coin, but a peculiar strain crossed her face. Her jaw flexed twice, and the corners of her mouth creased. Not wiser, Ember thought, the back of his neck crawling. More cunning, I think, but not wiser. This elder has seen so many seasons pass that not even he can be remembering them all. She paused for thought, and then said gently, but he is. Before he is dying, I mean. Both wise and good. And he tells me a story about this mountain. A story which is giving me hope, that what I seek is not gone from us forever. The treasure, you mean? Yes. She resumed her wriggling, and Ember was hard-pressed not to grab her arm to make her stop. He sings to me then, Ember. He sings a song as old as the world itself. Older than time. If only you were hearing his voice, you will surely know why I wish to find the mountain's door. For I, too, have a hole that cannot be filled, an empty place, though until then I am not knowing it. His song makes everything so clear. It is. Ah, I cannot describe it to you, nor sing as he can, for my voice is as dust to his, and the words are slipping from my memory. It is like a bright light breaking through clouds in the sky, or flashing through the crest of a wave. A lump formed in his throat. He had no clear idea of what she meant, but a memory glimmered in her eyes and the longing in her speech was plain enough. He saw that yearning etched on her face, the way she had looked at him those many days ago while he stood on his doorstep to watch her leave. I am knowing, at once, that I must find this treasure for myself, for the empty place, as you say, is more empty every day. Sometimes I fear it may consume me from within and leave nothing but a shell behind. The elder tells me that he has held this treasure within himself, long ago, and that if I am coming here, I will see the truth in what he speaks. You didn't need to bring me all the way here just to open the door, did you? Kentucky flipped the coin over in her hands, admiring its bronzed gleam. No, she confessed. I am thinking of your kind must be here. To return our treasure. Ember pinched the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers and shut his eyes. Why? Is this not your mountain? No. He growled, confused and exhausted. That gave her pause. You have as much right to this nest as any other man, she insisted at last. I have no hope of taking your treasure myself. I suppose the elder told you this as well. Yes. Ember opened his eyes and glanced sideways at her, still pinching his forehead. Did he tell you anything of use? There's much he has to tell, Kentucky said calmly. I do not think I am knowing it all. What if he was only charming you? Ember cautioned her, thinking of the siren which lay dead in the winding halls. Maybe there is no treasure, no way to restore your empty place. If you don't know what it looks like, where it is, or how to find it, I know it is true, Kentucky interrupted, clenching her hands around the coin. He cannot be lying. How's that? A siren who is not wise or good hears of his stories, and when the elder is called to atone for his words, he sings the same song to a gathering of the clans. Only, they do not let him finish his beautiful story, she whispered, her eyes glimmering. If only. Perhaps they will be wishing as I do. And come with me here. Ember could not speak, could barely think. Fragmented images flashed across his mind, not memories, or at least not his memories, of vast and stormy waters, and a pouring rain above, and darkness below. Deep, deep darkness, surrounded by salt and slimy weeds, where the water was cold and the rain could not reach. They take the elder into the deep waters and rend his flesh, and the water turns to blood and stinks of death, and they sing for the fishes, and the fishes come, and he is devoured. Kentucky's description was so detached and her words so very quick that Ember knew at once it was a memory she found troubling and did not wish to live again. She lowered her voice even further, and this time it trembled slightly. The clans are very bitter about the loss of their treasure, though so few remember it. It is never to be spoken of, even by an elder. Ember took an unsteady breath. And? You think I can find this treasure of yours? A somber twinkle livened her gaze. If you wish to, she conceded. But I have never doubted you. He stared at her for a moment, disturbed. If what this elder said is true, and some powerful relic or other was lost to the siren kind long ago, all of these men must have been killed for the sake of reclaiming this treasure. Maker's breath. The words of the lonely, twisted beast that had stalked them through the mountain suddenly did not seem so absurd. What is it? He demanded, sweat dampening his shirt. Anything. Do you know anything more about this treasure? I know only that it is mine, and I must have it, she crooned, an obvious attempt to soothe him. It halfway worked, and he sat in bothered silence for several minutes, watching her fuss with a hole in the knee of her trousers. He wondered if it had been torn during her frantic scramble to escape the mad siren. Could any man give it to you? Any man at all? Kentucky shrugged. Then why me? She met his stare, her eyes shiny in the dark. Because I like you, Ember. I like you, Ember. It filled him with the same mixture of confusion and anticipation it had in his old cabin while she sat across the table from him, munching garden greens. Then she added, almost too softly to hear, and your river is far. When no explanation seemed forthcoming, he inquired, from what? Kentucky turned the coin over in her hands one last time before tossing it away. It bounced down the hall and disappeared into the darkness, the sharp metallic echoes ringing long after it was gone. When the last echo faded, the siren spoke. Understand, Ember, that in seeking these secrets I abandoned all which is familiar to me. I can no more return to my nest than you can return to yours. For which I am sorry. Quiet anger laced her words, though anger at him or herself or something else entirely he could not tell. Very sorry. Eager to lighten the foul mood his question had sparked, Ember folded his hands beneath his head, adjusting his back on the cold floor, and gave a tremendous sigh. Humph. So all we have to do is find this treasure, and you'll be happy. I will be whole. And we don't know what it looks like, where it is, how to obtain it, we know nothing about it, in short. Yes. Kentucky glanced down at her intertwined hands. But you will try. He sighed again. He wasn't sure how he felt, exactly. Used. Manipulated. But he was too tired to explain that to Kentucky, and even if he did, it wouldn't change anything now. If this treasure is so important to you, and truly belonged to the sirens once. Ember groaned faintly. Then I suppose we might as well try to find it. We've come this far, after all. Her face sagged and her eyes fluttered closed, as if those were the words she had been waiting to hear since the moment she appeared on his doorstep. But we have to get out of this mountain, Kentucky, he warned her. If we see a path to freedom, We'll take it, without hesitation. We can agree on that, at least. She did not respond. He tried to find a reasonably comfortable position on the stone, grimacing as his bones popped and cracked. The noises were loud enough for Kentucky to flicker in ear at him. Finally he said, "You won't stop me, will you?" A long-suffering sigh pierced his soul. "No, Ember," she assured him. "I will not stop you." And with that, he felt, they had reached a mutual understanding, though he did wonder how long it would last. If Kentucky was so desperate to get her hands on this treasure, whatever it was, and he was necessary for the getting of it as he had feared, he doubted she would let him go so easily. Even if she thought she would now. Ember rubbed his hands across his face, overwhelmed. He was too sleepy to think properly, and his thoughts and fears and suspicions wandered in circles until at last he decided they would all have to wait until morning. Or, rather, after he had rested, for he had no way of knowing what hour it was in the outside world. Kentucky hummed, sweeping all of her hair over one shoulder, and for the first time since they had met he saw her yawn, her jaw stretched wide, fangs glinting in the stone light, blue tongue curled back toward her throat. A sigh and a squeak echoed through the hall, and then her mouth snapped shut and she licked her lips several times. The display almost managed to drag a smile out of him, and then his stomach growled, and a knot of pain formed in the middle of his body. He pressed a fist into his belly and shut his eyes as tightly as he could. He heard Kentucky lie down beside him. All was quiet. A pebble or drop of water plinked in a distant hall, and a breath of air echoed through the arched ceiling far above them, the sound of emptiness. His stomach growled again. "Hungry," he mumbled, by way of an explanation. "Sorry." After several moments of silence, Kentucky let out a shallow breath. "I am always hungry," she whispered. He found the statement disquieting, and even more so when she continued her soft murmurings as if speaking to herself, always feeding. Forever hungry. Never satisfied. He lay on the stone in a cold sweat, eyes closed, listening intently. But nothing more was said, and he could not even determine if she had meant for him to hear. Chapter 37 Sleep Song. No matter how he twisted and turned on the cold stone floor, no matter how he tried to think of pleasant things before the dreams consumed him, Ember always awakened with a start and in a sweat after only a few short minutes of rest, haunted by visions of that mangled corpse, the black eyes glossy in death, only to slip back into another fitful slumber. The worst of all his terrors was when the monster returned to life, stumbling after him with the old fishing spear protruding from its sunken chest. Always bleeding. Never dying. Ember tried to run, but tripped and fell, again and again. Sometimes he tripped over the body itself, tangled up in its cold crookedness. This time the dead siren snatched at his legs, gurgling infernal curses. He had to wake himself, had to break free of this nightmare. Sweat dripped into his eyes, blinding him. He pushed forward, stumbling out of the tangle of dead limbs, and a voice called out to him from the darkness. A beautiful voice. "This other place of yours is troubled tonight." He struggled to his feet, confused. The body had disappeared, and a mist clouded the trees before him. As he blinked away the visions of death and carnage, it parted slightly. He caught a glimpse of red hair, and an upturned corner of rosebud lips. "Go away," he muttered, turning around. "Go away?" came the sneering words. "Cast me out yourself. If you can." He shuddered, sinking to the ground and holding his head in his hands. "You're not really here," he said numbly, too exhausted from his recent terrors to fear a living girl such as she. Footsteps crunched through the leaves behind him and a bare foot shifted into view. Syl moved until she stood directly before him, and then crouched, her crimson hair wisping his arm. It was damp. And cold. He glanced up into the Sirena's toothy maw as her lips curled seductively over glistening fangs. Perfection, twisted into something truly terrible, but he noticed that her skin was paler than before, and her mouth had gone blue at the corners. When he glanced down again, he saw a puddle of melting snow at her feet. He wondered at it for a moment, but before he could make sense of the discrepancy, the Sirena spoke. "I see you better, now," she crooned, fluttering her frosty lashes. "Better, in the darkness." Yes. Little boy, lost and lonely, with no one to look after him. Is that not so? He crooked his elbow over his eyes and sat down, breathing deeply. He had more questions for Sil, but she had come to him in such a state that all of those lesser concerns had long since fled his mind. He wanted only to awaken. Perhaps if he calmed himself, the dream would end. What is this other place in which we always meet? Sil murmured after a time. It is much different here, tonight. So many whispering visions. This strange magic of yours, I like it. It's the power of the oracles, Ember grumbled again, no longer emboldened by those words. I'm only dreaming. And I hate it here. The forest was murky, as if twilight had fallen in his absence, and the trees looked even colder and blacker than before. It was a dead place. A hushed place. He scrunched his fingers into his hair, gritting his teeth. A waiting place. Waiting for something, though what that something was he could not have said. These visions which chase you, Sil murmured. The one with the dead eye, whom you slew. Does the hunter weep for his prey? His neck prickled. Tell me, I confess, I am curious, is there any part of your kind, however small, which glories in his anguish? Which rejoiced in the spilling of his blood? Ember looked away, willing her to disappear. Admit it, boy. You delight in the dripping death you dealt him in that hour. I had no choice, he snapped, digging his nails into his palms, slick with sweat. I had to keep her safe. But he bit the words from his tongue. You chose what we all choose, in the end, satisfaction. Once you have a taste of death, there is nothing else which sates our appetites. Delicious, isn't it? The futile struggle, the final gasp. The light of their eyes, slipping into the night, as you feast upon their fear. Now, onto another. Always more. More, and more. Ember unclenched his hands and glanced down. His fingers were wet. Not with sweat. Thick black blood pattered on the melted snow as his fingers shook. Frosted breath stirred his hair, whispering softly in his ear, "Who might you devour next, I wonder?" Gah! Ember sat bolt upright, gasping, and then pressed a hand to his forehead in relief as her hiss faded into the darkness. His scalp tingled. Drawn by some instinct, he turned, and came nose to nose with a shadow sitting right beside him, staring down like a specter in the dark. Scrambling for fish butter, Ember scooted backward across the floor, struggling to find his footing, and then froze as a familiar voice murmured, "What troubles you?" He took an unsteady breath, relaxing his grip on Fishbitter's hilt, and closed his eyes again as it turned into a yawn. Her voice soothed some of his fear, and almost managed to wash the bloody horrors from his mind. "Nothing," he mumbled, resting the base of his skull on the stone floor. He kept his eyes closed, half hoping she would speak again. He did not have long to wait. "That is a lie. I am telling you true things." "So you did," admitted Ember with a grimace. "Are you in pain, Ember?" Her voice was soft. "Did the shining stone not make you well?" "No. I'm well enough." She shifted closer again. "Then why do you make faces and sounds which are like dying?" There would, he dimly realized, be no dissuading her. Embarrassed, he confessed, "Bad dreams." The silence stretched on so long that at last he opened his eyes to see Kentucky sitting very near him, staring down with somber eyes. The blurry image blinked, and then said quietly, "Then it is true, men dream. Everyone dreams." He stared back, letting the strangeness of her question sink in. "You don't. Sleep is an abyss. No dancing visions come to me in the wacklessness. I see darkness." She leaned closer, her floral musk enveloping him with a welcome freshness that drove away the damp and dark, a breath of the forest, a whisper of clear flowing rivers and woodland glades. "What is it like to dream?" He folded his hands beneath his head and sighed deeply. Little wonder that Sil had no concept of his strange magic. Stifling another yawn, Ember thought about it for a moment. "Well, you see and do things as if you were awake. But sometimes they're impossible things, or memories made new. And sometimes you're a different person altogether." Kentucky stared at him, a wisp of yearning flitting across her face. "That is interesting," she said genuinely. Very interesting. Sometimes, he agreed absently. Do you ever dream about me? He glanced sideways at her, caught off guard. Maybe. I haven't known you very long. He thought this rather an obvious dodge, but wasn't about to mention the dreams which plagued him in the Oracle's sanctuary. To his relief, she nodded as if she understood, then sighed wistfully. I should like to have a dream sometime. He closed his eyes. Would you dream about me? I am not deciding yet. Ember snorted. You don't get to choose your dreams. No? No. I haven't had a good dream since we came to this place. Kentucky paused, reflecting, and then shifted slightly. This is very sad. I am not knowing this will happen to you here. He opened his eyes again, staring stolidly up at the ceiling. But you would have brought me anyway, he asserted. A long minute passed between them, and, oddly, Ember felt more connected to Kentucky than he ever had before. For there was no secret between them, no hidden intentions. He knew she would have, and she knew how he felt about it. It was the truth, cold and hard, and no amount of siren magic could soften what simply was. Yes, she whispered with a gentle shudder. I would have. Ember sighed, and said nothing. After a few moments, Kentucky shifted, and murmured, If what? He mumbled, barely moving his lips. I would sing to you, Ember, if you wish it, she ventured softly. I want that you will not fear so much the power of my song. Only lift a finger, and it shall silence me swiftly. He considered it, and pleasant memories of her humming on the path up the mountain floated through his mind. It was tempting, but to openly invite such manipulation of his senses felt foolish, especially after all that had transpired. Ember took a breath to speak. She flinched slightly, as if she expected him to shout. Why do you want to sing? He asked quietly. That you may rest tonight. That surprised him. Yawning again, Ember rolled onto his side and snuggled his face into the crook of his elbow. But he did not forbid her, and she must have taken it as an assent, for her voice lifted as he made himself as comfortable as possible on the cold floor. At first the melody she chose was so strange to him that he thought she was singing in siren tongue. Soon he realized they were human words, and he wondered if it were a siren song meant to be sung to a mortal, or had simply been translated from the ballads of her own people. Dawn will crash upon the waves in froth and foamy gold, but I may sing till break of day while all is dark and cold. Sleep, my heart, until the sun leaps up to kiss her sky. For when you wake, I shall be gone, though you shall wonder why. It was a disquieting tune, and struck him as an ethereal, twisting lament, though it was clear that Kentucky had not sung it often, for several words were mispronounced. Dream of cliffs along the bay, of white sands shining bright, do not bethink me cruel nor cold to flee by morning's light. And if you remember me, remember breath and song, forsake all else to shadow black, my face to darkness long. Oh, you shall see my footprints there, upon the sandy shore. Wonder where I wander to and wander evermore. Her human words eased his troubled soul, and he wondered if it was a lullaby. After that simple song was finished she wandered into other tunes, a few in her own tongue, some more cheerful than others. Most he knew he would remember long after that night, and likely ponder their meaning until the end of his days. A fleeting moment of panic overtook him as the power of her voice pressed upon his senses, muffling his thoughts and slowing the rhythm of his heart, but before he could dwell overmuch upon it, the rest of his worries lifted from him. Thus, he drifted off to sleep with her voice in his ear, singing of scuttling crabs and shells that sang when you whistled into them, and soft footprints left in summer sands only to be swept away by the rippling waves. Sonorous humming lured Ember ever deeper into the dusk. He knew silhouetted him somewhere, out there. But he couldn't keep his feet from shuffling slowly through the leaves. Gloomy darkness gripped his waking dreams, and as he wandered, the stillness of the stagnant air lifted before a faint breeze. It stirred his hair, carrying with it a sound like a distant voice. Come, Ember. He paused, curling his fingers around the low branch of a tree. The sound reminded him very much of Kentucky's voice, of the way which she had called him up from the Blackwoods, in the sister's footstool. He couldn't decide if he were still hearing her lullaby somehow, drifting into his dream from the outside world, or if he were imagining it all together. "Come and find me, Ember. Come and find me." The mist trailed away as he changed course, and he noted that the trees became sparser as the dusky gloom began to fade. He had not traveled a great distance before the crooning tones of Syl faded altogether, the forest became a clearing, and a bright ray of sunlight sifted down from above. Daisies bobbed in the summery draught, and the mist swirled away into nothing. Ember gratefully sank to his knees in the tall grass, and then flopped flat on his back. He had never dreamed a dream that felt so real, the daisies nodding above him, the clear blue sky, the sun warming his skin. He breathed deeply and closed his eyes, smiling at nothing and everything. He wasn't sure how he knew she would come if he closed his eyes and kept them closed, but he did. And he was rewarded by a faint rustling in the daisies as she sat beside him, her scent drifting over his head on the breeze, musk and river water and forest flowers. A gentle humming filled the air, blending the songs of nature into one chorus. Soft enough that the buzzing bees and flies could still be heard, yet even so the bird songs and rippling stream could not drown it out. Ember twitched a finger, asking for her hand, but she never touched him. She, unlike the temptress, seemed little more real than a thought or a wish. He could see her watchful figure, in his periphery, but found it impossible to look at her directly, for she always wavered out of view. A ghostly companion. Her shadow flitted over his closed eyes now and again as she plucked the daisies, and a shiver of nostalgia swept through him as he understood what she was doing. Golden memories drifted back. The front stoop, his sister's hair braided and glowing in the morning light, his mother creaking over the wooden boards in the cabin and the smell of fish sizzling with wild herbs, and a pile of forest flowers between them as their youthful fingers flashed, each fashioning a crown of the earth's fragile jewels. "Sleep, Ember," Kentucky murmured. He tried to open his eyes, but the sun was so soft and warm and the daisies so pleasant a pillow that he almost didn't want to. "Ember," she whispered, her shadow blocking out the sun. "Sleep." When his eyes finally opened, the daisy field was gone. A shadowy ceiling arched far above, dripping echoes whispered from a distant hall, and the bluish dusk of the mountain settled over him, chill as an early spring morning. The only warmth came from the yellow light of the stone which sat on the floor. Between himself and Kentucky Flea, the Sirena lay very close, as still as a corpse, pale and wet and cold. He stared at her ribs for a moment to be sure she was breathing, and then tried to see her face through her hair. A few glossy black strands moved when she exhaled. Her eyes were shut, motionless, lashes long against her cheeks, and her lips were soft and void of all emotion. He found the sight so unsettling that he closed his eyes again, and did not open them until he heard Kentucky stirring awake. "Refuge. Is that a tree?" Kentucky leaned over the map beside Ember, poking the inked symbol with a claw. "It looks like a tree," she mused. "Can you make the light any brighter?" The Sirena retrieved the stone light and blew on it gently, holding it close to the creased parchment. Both of them had agreed that the first and most reasonable thing to do that morning was search for food, even if it meant a detour from their path to the plains gate. "So, we are here, probably." He tapped the spot, then moved his finger along the hall. "Pretty near the center of the mountain, I guess. But there don't seem to be any places for sleeping nearby, not until we get a bit closer to the other side. And nothing that looks like those kitchens I found. But if there's a tree, maybe there's I don't know. Garden of some sort? Greens, maybe. Kentucky stabbed the parchment again. "I am wishing there is a river there, with fish." "Well, let's not get too greedy," Ember sighed, sitting back and dragging his fingers through his hair. It was getting rather wild, which made him wonder how long they'd been wandering the mountain, but attempting to tame his curls with fish bitter seemed a poor use of such a fine blade. "But I'd prefer some fish myself." The thought of freshly cooked meat made his mouth water, particularly after the foul-tasting moss he had forced himself to eat. Now even that would seem a blessing. He folded the map and stuffed it back under his belt, yawning and getting to his knees. He felt sick to his empty stomach and his body was bruised from sleeping on stone, but he didn't complain. Better not to remind Kentucky how hungry she was, not that she was liable to forget. I suppose. He yawned again, slinging the pack over his shoulders and buckling Fishbitter into place. We'd best be off. He said it more to himself than to Kentucky, for while he was rested and knew full well that the only chance of finding sustenance was to continue onward, the last thing he wanted to do was trudge on through the darkness on an empty stomach. As if he had grumbled aloud, Kentucky hummed two soft notes. Some of the hunger pangs eased, his knotted muscles loosened, and the lingering fogginess of sleep faded from his eyes. "Thanks," he muttered, and she seemed surprised to be acknowledged. A smile touched her face as she fell in step beside him. In this way, they continued down the winding hall, Ember pausing occasionally to glance at the map when they came to a crossroads, and Kentucky humming all the while, sometimes taking an extra hop to keep stride. He thought he recognized the melody from his dream here and there, but it always wandered into another before he could be certain. Nonetheless, the dream reminded him of his family, and thoughts of his family put him in mind of bygone days, and he soon found himself entirely lost to pleasant old memories he had not allowed himself to dwell upon since his sister moved away. He didn't notice that Kentucky's humming had stopped, nor that she was no longer walking alongside him until a loud and terrified shriek split the corridor. "Ember! Ah!" he howled, clapping his hands over his ears and spinning around. Kentucky stood with her arms raised, palms out as if pressed against an invisible wall. Her mouth hung open, eyes wide. She shoved, then smacked a different spot to no avail. He let his hands fall and sprinted back toward Kentucky. "Ember," she huffed frantically, pounding a fist against the nothingness. It made no sound, but some force prevented her from moving beyond that barrier. Her lip trembled, then curled and she bared her fangs, glaring at the empty space. "I cannot follow." Ember stopped before her, passing a hand through the space beside Kentucky's head. He felt nothing. He stepped through. Kentucky grabbed him, throwing both arms around his body with a desperate gasp. Stumbling backwards, Ember tried to put out his own arms for balance, but Kentucky had pinned them in place and would not let go. Her crushing strength surprised him. "Kentucky?" he grunted, managing to wriggle one of his hands free of her fierce embrace. She released a trembling hum. It shivered through his chest, filling him from head to toe with a protective warmth, and she squeezed more tightly. No female creature had ever thrown herself at Ember in such a fashion, nor held him with such ferocity, and for a moment his mind went blank. He stood very still, feeling her heart patter frantically against his ribs. Then he awkwardly ruffled her hair with his free hand. "It's all right, Kentucky," he mumbled, blushing furiously. "We'll figure this out. Do not leave me." Her voice was muffled against his sleeve. Ember slowly worked his fingers through her oily tangle of hair, flinching slightly as he touched the tip of a cold, membranous ear. "I won't do that," he said quietly. "I promise. And I don't break my promises." Her grip loosened and a soft sigh cooled his skin. He shivered and grasped her hand, pulling it away from his waist, although in truth, wished her touch to linger. She stepped back slightly, lacing her fingers through his, and her black eyes darted to the unseen wall. Ember stepped through again, holding on to her tightly. "Ah!" Kentucky cried as their hands locked in place. "No." A faint, unpleasant tingle shot up to his elbow as she tugged him back. "Don't panic," he insisted as calmly as he could manage, but his own heart was pounding hard, and not merely from their predicament. Her musk was overpowering, and made it difficult to think rationally. So, that siren was trapped here, he reasoned. A flicker of pity swept aside his horror for the thing. It made sense. A man must have enchanted this hallway, perhaps to give any remaining kinsman time to flee, or to waylay a group of sirens 1,000 years ago. But if Kentucky could not pass through it, what would he do? He could never leave her behind, not now, but he had to eat something soon or he'd starve. She would starve. He could go on ahead and find some food, and bring it back to her. And then what? Keep bringing her food until you die. She will outlive you, you fool. You'd have to find somebody and tell them about her. and there's no guarantee that you'd make it out of this mountain alive, or return with food at all. Ember was already contemplating the unpleasant fate that might await him with a hunger-mad Serena for a companion when Kentucky let out a high-pitched squeal and covered her mouth with her hand. Her face had turned a deathly shade of white, and she stared through him in bleak horror. He knew then that the same thought had entered her mind. "Come here," he suggested hesitantly, tugging on her hand. The Sirena approached, still clutching his fingers tightly. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, swallowing any lingering embarrassment, then muttered, "Let go." She hesitated, and then threw her arms around his waist again. "No, no," and Ember tucked her cold hands between them. "I'm going to try something." He encircled her with both his own arms, holding her as close as he could manage and covering as much of her body as he could with his own. He tried not to think over much about what he was doing, but a small part of him very much enjoyed the closeness, and on the whole he felt terribly vulnerable. A pleased hum informed him that she had caught on to his idea, and she made herself as small as possible, pressing even closer as he backed toward the barrier. "Stand on my feet." She shifted her full weight to his leather shoes, rising up to the tips of her toes, and he shuffled backward through the invisible wall, bowing his head so that his chin brushed her damp head. A clear ping like a tiny bell echoed above. And they passed through, together. Kentucky exhaled loudly, shoulders drooping in relief. "Ah. See?" Ember declared with forced cheerfulness, ruffling her hair again, something he would not have dared to do a few days ago. He rather liked it. "We figured it out." She stepped primly off his shoes and dragged her claws through her hair, neatening the strands he had mussed. "Yes," she whispered weakly, her eyes darting all around the hall. "Now, let us never be speaking of it again." He watched her a moment longer, trying to decide whether to be offended, and then shrugged. "As you like." Ember took a swig of water and handed her the flask, wiping a few drops of sweat from his brow. But as soon as she finished and he had fastened it to the pack, she reached out and took his hand in hers with a pleased hum, and did not let go again. Refuge Part 2. Falsefish. Snail skin. Tale teller. Kentucky hummed more loudly, muffling the accusations. They had not troubled her since her time apart from Ember. Other songs had taken their place, of rock and stone and heart and bone, and enchanted human treasures in water flowing underfoot, but the voice of her own conscience chided her. Ever since her words with Ember, she had not used so many words as, perhaps, she should have, and yet he seemed satisfied, for now. Therefore, she would continue to hoard them as long as she might, offering a drop here and there rather than the whole drink at once. It might be too much for him. It might drown him. But this was not the first of her concerns, for Kentucky was burdened by the uncanny suspicion that they were being followed. A suspicion she had harbored since Ember had first come to find her, and of which she had become convinced only recently. This watcher was much different from the presence of the lonely siren, whose scent and song yet haunted her, nor anything of flesh and blood. A flicker of starlight, breaking through the shadows. A faint ripple in the pools of forgotten spells, not a living song so much as the broken reverberations of a song. And sometimes a whispered word or two, human words too soft to understand. If an enchantment, it was unlike any which she had yet encountered, and what she did not understand could not be warded against. She could no longer sense its echo, but she wondered if it were watching them from afar. Kentucky shivered and hissed, too softly for Ember to hear. He did, however, notice that she had stopped humming and turned his head. She tossed her hair and gave him her most charming smile, watching him turn that pleasing shade of pink. She had begun to crave that soft look, that glimmer in his eyes. He seemed more her Ember than ever before. And she liked it. He had pursued her, returned for her. Been wounded by her, killed in her interests. For once, Syl had been mistaken. There was surely a deep, deep magic yet lingering in humankind, and her Ember would surely prove it. "Is anything the matter?" he asked, smiling ruefully back and pulling his hand free to scratch at his neck. "Is anything the matter?" Kentucky chewed the inside of her cheek. "Yes, many things. But none she wished to speak of, at present." "The stone beneath us is singing much more loudly," Kentucky informed him instead, working a knot out of her hair with her fingers and enjoying the scent that his hands had left behind, salty sweat and linen and leather, and that peculiar fragrance which only humans possessed. She stamped her foot on the floor, directly over one of the glowing patches. They had reappeared not long after they left the winding hall, and this time lay much closer to the surface. "Is it?" he murmured, pausing to look at the floor and then the glowing walls. "How so?" "I am not sure. But it is more alive than other stone." "Magic?" "It is a wild magic, yes." He raised an eyebrow at her. "Wild magic?" "Magic, that is," she tried again. "Not magic that is made to be." "I think I see. It's the difference between Isabel's herb garden and that bunch of napalm we found growing in the sister's footstool." "How far until the tree?" she asked, clasping her hands behind her back. Ember obligingly pulled out the map, shaking it open and holding it at arm's length from his face. He squinted, but there was no need for the stone light. The hall had grown brighter. "It might be another stone tree," he said doubtfully. "That symbol looks too big to be truthful, but it shouldn't take us more than a short while of walking." His brows dipped as he said short while, and she wondered if he was being entirely truthful. When he glanced at her she could see the worry in his eyes. Her own hunger was a dark shadow in her mind, a void, she knew, that would slowly spread until it began to consume all other voices, as it always did and always would. But she was forever hungry, and had been hungrier and lived. "Come, then," she murmured, taking his hand. "Snail skin." Kentucky hummed. The further they walked, the more brilliant the light became. It was a soft shift, like the brightening of a starry sky before the sun had risen, but it stirred something awake in Ember. Something he had half forgotten ever since leaving the Oracle's sanctuary. A longing for the open air, for fields and rivers and woodlands. It felt as if they had entered a sacred place, a secret deep in the mountain, and Ember took care to tread lightly. Even Kentucky eventually stopped her humming again, and that's when he noticed the trembling in the air. He remarked on it, and she decided with some surprise that he must be hearing the stone's song. It wasn't so much a sound as the idea of a sound, like the lingering vibration after a loud echo. But an echo was the dying away of a noise, and this felt like the beginning of something, thriving and thrumming under the ground. The stone glowed so brightly that Ember had to squint his eyes when Kentucky let out a startled cry and gripped his hand excitedly. Before he could ask any questions, she bounced once and started to run, pulling him along. He needed no siren song to lend him strength, for the music in the stone refreshed him and his own anticipation of what might be to come gave him an invigorating rush. Intense light flooded the hall. He tripped and Kentucky let go of his hand, running as fast as she could. Ember staggered after her, winded and starving and desperate for the touch of the sun. The scent of fragrant leaves and summer harvests beckoned him onward. A double door hung slightly open, a grand tree carved in bas-relief on the ordinary stone. It was tall and thick, and heavy enough to crush them if it fell. As they drew nearer he could see scraggly branches reaching through the entrance. Kentucky reached it first and ducked into the foliage, disappearing. "Kentucky, wait!" Ember panted, stumbling the last 5 steps to the bushes and shouldering his way in after her. Twigs scratched at his face and yanked on his curls, and he snapped several branches in his haste. He glimpsed her pale form flashing in front of him, and brushed aside a few strands of her hair that had been snagged by the bush. The light grew stronger still, and he blinked rapidly as his eyes adjusted. Kentucky pulled away. He reached out blindly. And then she dropped out of view altogether, lost to the tangled thickets underfoot. He tripped over something soft and unyielding, but he was already moving too fast to keep himself from pitching forward. Shoving the foliage aside with a surprised yell, Ember collapsed with a splash in shallow water. "Oh," he groaned, pushing himself up on his elbows and brushing tiny pebbles from his palms. The siren patted her fingers in the water with a delighted cry, but Ember's attention had already turned to the bushes that lay just across the stream. They were loaded with giant purple berries, branches sagging under the weight. "Food!" cried Ember. Kentucky shouted a word in her own language, which sounded much the same. They both splashed through the water and threw themselves down before the overgrown bushes, grabbing fistfuls of the purple clusters and shoving them heedlessly into their mouths. The berries burst easily between his teeth, and he set about picking them and eating them as fast as he possibly could, ignoring the juice that dribbled down his chin. Flavors akin to blackberry and cherry and rich plum wine mingled on his tongue. He had never tasted anything so pure and so nourishing in his entire life. Ember was so hungry he hardly cared if they were poison, for at least he would die satisfied. He laughed out loud, turning his gaze to the heavens in thanks, and froze. Tangled branches formed a roof over their heads, dark woods and light woods intertwined from an orchard of overgrown bushes and trees, but the light that filtered through was sharp and white and tinged with the hues of amber and gold. A hauntingly familiar sight. Ember stared a moment longer, and then returned his attention to the berry bush. His stomach was aching to be filled. Everything else could wait. He forced himself to eat more slowly, wary of the cramps that often plagued him when food was scarce, but the berries were kind and all was well. He ate until his fingers were sticky with juice and his mouth was full of sugary sweetness, and at last he could bring himself to eat no longer. When he was finished, he emptied the flask before refilling it in the stream. The water was surprisingly pleasing to the touch, neither too warm nor too cold, and he was so full and so strangely content with his lot in life, that for a few moments he simply rested upon the bank and watched it flow. The twisted branches and scattered leaves above him created a striking latticework of shadows on the shallow stream, and pinpoints of brilliant light glimmered off the ripples here and there. He looked up again, squinting. Sunlight. It had to be. The unmistakable sound of smacking lips caught his attention, and he turned to see Kentucky crouched under a nearby bush. She was busily licking the juice from her fingers and claws. Kentucky? He spoke in a whisper without knowing why. The garden seemed strangely alive, and he shivered at the thought of angering an ancient place steeped in so much magic. Let's go further in. I want to know where that light is coming from. She muttered a few words in the siren tongue, clearly distracted, and plucked another berry from the bush. Kentucky. HMH. He knew he should wait for her to finish before wandering off, but the light was too intriguing, and she seemed in no hurry to accompany him. If I encounter anything dangerous, I'll turn back right away, he thought, and it seemed to him a reasonable compromise. The garden felt safe, almost as safe as the oracle's sanctuary, but he knew better than to bumble ahead without taking any precautions. Everything here had a wild, slightly feral appearance. Getting to his feet, Ember drew fish bitter with a metallic rasp, a sound which he now found very pleasing, and pushed past the initial web of branches, hacking his way deeper into the orchard. The sword glimmered dimly in the shadows, and every now and then he paused to be sure it was not damaged. Whoever had enchanted the blade must have taken great care, or it would not have been in such good condition to begin with. Regardless, it pained him to use the weapon as a common tool. Ember had passed too many of the twisted trees and tangled shrubs to count when a sunny glow broke through the leaves directly in front of him. With a final shove, he snapped a few weak branches and staggered out of the orchard, throwing an arm across his eyes to shield himself from the dazzling light. Once his cave-dimmed eyes had recovered enough to peer upward, he realized that the radiance came not from the sun, but from a tree. A giant tree, one so magnificently tall and girthy that Ember knew at a glance it would have taken him nearly a full minute to walk around the bole of it. It towered proudly in the center of the overgrown garden, ascending to such a height that Ember had to crane his neck to see it. Each bough was laden with what appeared to be liquid crystal, and a golden syrup glowed from within, each drop a glittering jewel fit for a king. When he shaded his eyes, he could distinguish a few faint swirls of wood beneath the thinnest layers of sap. A secondary light source streamed from above, distant sunshine peering through a hole at the top of the domed cave. The light was faint, but refracted by broad green leaves. The branches appeared to be swaying slightly near the uppermost reaches of the cavern, but it might have been his imagination or his limited sight. Maker's breath, Ember muttered. As he spoke, he shivered, overwhelmed by the ponderous magic of the tree. It was, he thought, a good magic, though far beyond his Kentucky in its presence, He understood how very young he was. This entity had endured for centuries, and for centuries it would remain. The feeling of inadequacy and naivete slowly faded as he stared into its golden depths. At last, he felt wiser simply for having seen it, and knowing it existed.